The rain had not stopped since before dawn, and the mountain did not look the same as it had the evening before. Yuki was moving along the trail the landslide had rearranged overnight when she stopped. Below a boulder that had not been there yesterday, something dark and very small was pressed against the ground. It did not move. She came closer, crouched down, and looked. I was lying in the mud with his eyes open, his chest rising and falling in small, unsteady rhythms. His body no larger than both of her fists held together. 3 weeks old, perhaps, no more than that, alone. She looked up and around, scanning the tree line, the broken slope, the gray morning in every direction. There was nothing. She unzipped her rain jacket, lifted him carefully from the mud, and wrapped him against her chest. Then she stood up and began the walk back. The voice on the phone was calm and precise, and it told her what she had already suspected. The road was cut. The vehicle could not reach her for at least 3 days, and in the meantime, she would need to manage on her own. The technician walked her through the formula, the ratios, the water temperature, the frequency, every 2 to 3 hours without exception, through the night if necessary. She listened, repeated the instructions back, and hung up. The first feeding took a long time. The bottle was too large for his face, the nipple too wide, and the milk ran down his chin and onto her sleeve before he found the angle that worked. And she sat on the floor with her back against the wall and held him in the crook of her arm and did not move until he had finished. He weighed almost nothing. When she set him down afterward, on the folded fleece she had cut from a larger piece and placed in the corner, pressing the edges flat, testing the warmth of the surface with the back of her hand before lowering him onto it. He made a sound she had not heard before, a thin, ascending cry that filled the small room completely and did not stop when she stepped back. She picked him up again. The sound stopped. She stood in the middle of the room with him against her chest and understood, in a way that required no particular thought, that the room and the fleece and the careful arrangement of the corner were not the point, and that she was the point, and that this was going to be more complicated than she had prepared for. A Japanese macaque infant at 3 weeks cannot yet regulate its own body temperature. The systems that will one day allow it to sit calmly in mountain snow are still forming. And without the continuous warmth of another body against it, the body's energy shifts rapidly away from growth and toward the simpler problem of staying alive, a problem with a shorter window than it appears. She did not put him down again that night. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and him held against her sternum, and she dozed in the intervals between feedings, waking to the sounds he made in the dark, warming the formula in the pan of water on the burner, feeding him in the low light of the single lamp she had left on, and settling him back against her before closing her eyes. When the gray light came through the window again, she was still on the floor and her back ached, and he was asleep. And she sat without moving for a moment and listened to him breathe. By the second night, she had learned the difference between the sound he made when he was hungry and the sound he made when the temperature had dropped and it was warmth rather than food he needed. And she had learned that these were not always separable, and that on the nights when they converged, the only thing that worked was her hand held flat against his back, still and warm, until the sound stopped. She moved the low mattress from the storage room into the corner near the burner and slept there for the remainder of the weeks, close enough to hear every shift in his breathing, close enough that when he woke in the dark, his cry reached her before she was fully conscious and she was already moving. The road crew reached the first collapse point and found a second one below it, and the estimate extended without apology. The paperwork that would authorize the transfer moved between offices in a city 4 hours away, each desk requiring the signature of the one before it. The signatures arriving with the patience of institutions that are not themselves waiting for anything in particular. The center in the valley had a waiting list, and his name was added to the bottom of it, and the list moved at its own pace. She did not choose any of this. She simply continued, feeding and warming and feeding again, washing the bottle after every use and placing it upside down on the rack, smoothing the fleece each morning before setting him back on it. And the days accumulated the way days do when there is only one task in them, and the task does not end. The small room at the back of the station became the place where they both spent the hours. She at the table near the window during the parts of the day when he slept, and he in the corner on the fleece, or later against her shoulder, or curled in the crook of her arm in the particular way he had found in the first week and returned to without variation. She washed the bottle after every feeding and placed it upside down on the rack beside the burner, in the same position every time. She warmed the formula to the same temperature each time, testing it against the inside of her wrist, the way the technician had described, and she did not proceed until it was right. These were not gestures of tenderness. They were the structure of a day that needed structure, repeated until they became the shape of the day itself, indistinguishable from necessity, which is perhaps another name for the same thing. I was not a pet, and she did not treat him as one. He was a living thing that required specific conditions in order to continue living. And she provided those conditions with the same attention she gave to the equipment checks and weather records that filled the rest of her hours at the station. This was what she told herself in the early weeks, on the mornings when the telling still felt like something she needed to do. It began with a sound she almost missed. Before she opened the door each morning, her hand already on the latch, her mind already moving through the sequence of tasks ahead. There was a small noise from inside the room, low and rounded. Nothing like the sharp distress calls of the early nights. Primatologists call it a contact call. The vocalization an infant macaque makes not from hunger or fear, but from recognition. The sound of a body that has located something familiar and is simply confirming that it is still there. He heard her footsteps in the corridor, and he answered them. She began to pause for a moment before opening the door, and the sound would come again from the other side, patient, small, without urgency. And she would stand in the corridor for a few seconds before going in, not for any reason she could have named. She began arriving a few minutes earlier than she needed to, without deciding to. There was a morning when she set the bottle on the low shelf and stepped back toward the door to give him the space to feed without her. A step the technician had mentioned as useful, a small beginning of the distance that would eventually need to exist between them. He did not move toward the bottle. He sat very still in the center of the fleece and looked at it and then at the door. And his posture had a quality of waiting that was different from the waiting of hunger. More patient, more absolute. The waiting of something that has learned that what it needs will eventually come through a particular door and has decided simply to wait for the door. She stayed at the door. He stayed by the bottle. The room held its quiet in the particular way that a room holds quiet when two living things are both holding still inside it, neither one willing to be the first to change the arrangement. She tried again at the next feeding and at the one after that. And by the afternoon of that same, she had moved the low stool into the corner and sat down without comment, and he crossed the fleece and drank. She did not try the door again. What an infant macaque learns in the first weeks of life, about proximity, about the reliability of another presence, about what it means to reach for something and find it there, becomes the internal map against which all future relationships are measured. And the map drawn in these early weeks is the most durable one the animal will ever make. She sat with this in the quiet mornings, not trying to resolve it into something more comfortable than it was, simply letting it be true in the room alongside everything else that was true. He climbed to her shoulder in the afternoons, not with any evident purpose, but because it was the highest stable point available to him. And height for a young macaque carries a meaning older than thought. The place where the field of vision is widest, where the body can finally stop calculating the angles of approach from below. She let him stay and continued her work, and the afternoons passed with his small weight on her shoulder, and the sound of wind off the ridge, and the light moving in long strips across the floor. The days settled into their shape, and the shape stopped feeling temporary, and she stopped noticing the moment it had stopped. Then, one evening, the sun already behind the ridge, the room going the particular blue of mountain dusk, he turned his head away from her and looked at the window. He had not done this before. His body went very quiet. The stillness of an animal attending to something with full concentration and he looked at the glass and at the dark shapes of the pines on the other side of it, and his ears moved almost imperceptibly toward whatever was reaching him through the sealed pane. Some register of the cold air pressing against the warm glass, some frequency of the mountain that a human body would not have caught. I held it for a long time. She did not move. She watched his ears and the small adjustments his head made. A degree left, then still, then a degree right, the way an animal triangulates a sound. It is trying to locate precisely, and there was no sound that she could hear, nothing beyond the ordinary quiet of the station in the evening. But whatever he was receiving through the glass, he received it with his whole body. His weight shifted forward slightly onto his front hands. His tail curved low, his breathing slowed. She watched him look. When he turned back to the room, the adjustment was gradual. First his ears, then his head, then his weight settling back onto the fleece. And he looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her in the evenings, with the particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize as his equivalent of simply being in the same place. And then he looked away again, at the middle of the room. At nothing. She looked at the window after he had looked away, at the trees going dark, at the pale strip of sky still holding its last light above the ridge. And the room was quiet around her, and the mountain was there beyond the glass, continuous and indifferent. And she did not try to make anything of what she was thinking, because the thinking did not resolve into words, and she had learned, in the weeks since the first night on the floor, not to require that it should. That was the evening. The next morning, the center called before she had opened his door, and she stood in the corridor with the phone against her ear and learned that the road was open, that a vehicle would arrive within the day, that everything was in order. She said that she understood and thanked them and ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment, then she opened his door. The contact call came before she was fully inside. The same low, rounded sound that had been waiting on the other side of the door every morning for weeks. And she stood in the doorway and listened to it finish before she went in and began the last feeding. Afterward, she folded the fleece more slowly than usual. In thirds, the long edges meeting, the corners pressed flat with the heel of her hand, and placed it on the shelf above the table rather than back on the floor. She rinsed the bottle and set it upside down on the rack in the usual spot. Then she sat down in the corner of the room and waited for the sound of tires on the gravel outside. The transport crate was small and plain, and the technician who brought it was efficient and unhurried. The transfer proceeded the way these things are designed to proceed, directly, with as little disturbance as possible on either side. She lifted him from her shoulder and lowered him toward the opening of the crate. He gripped her finger. It was the same grip he had used on the first morning in the mud, the full, instinctive grip of a primate infant, for whom holding on is not a choice but a condition of being alive. And she held still for a moment with his hand closed around her finger and his eyes on her face. Then she unfolded his fingers one at a time, carefully, the way one unfolds something that is held tightly, not from stubbornness, but from not yet knowing that letting go is also survivable. The crate door closed, the vehicle door closed. She stood at the edge of the gravel, with her arms at her sides, and watched the van move down the mountain road and disappear around the first curve in the trees. And then there was only the road and the sound of the wind and the mountain, which had not changed. She stood there a moment longer, with one arm still slightly raised, her hand open at the level of her shoulder, before she noticed and let it fall. Inside, she took the bottle from the rack and washed it with soap and hot water, turning it slowly under the tap, and set it upside down to dry. She crossed to the table and opened the drawer and took out the printed instruction sheet. The formula ratios, the feeding temperatures, the signs to watch for, and folded it along the creases it had already made for itself over the weeks, the paper soft now at the fold lines from having been opened and closed so many times, and placed it back in the drawer. Not in the bin, the drawer. The fleece was folded on the shelf, and the bottle was on the rack, and the instruction sheet was in the drawer, and the room was the same size it had always been, and the light came through the window at the same angle, falling across the same section of empty floor. She sat down at the table and opened her work. The mountain outside continued without her. The pines moving in a low wind off the ridge, the mud on the trail drying at the edges, the clouds parting in the west to let through a late and level light that fell on everything equally and meant nothing in particular. She did not go to the window. She had work to do, and she did it. And the afternoon passed the way afternoons pass when there is nothing left to wait for. The rehabilitation center occupied a broad, flat stretch of valley, an hour's drive from the nearest town, surrounded by secondary forest on 3 sides and a service road on the 4th. And the outdoor enclosure was larger than it appeared from the entrance. A wide, open space with wooden climbing structures at various heights, a low-roofed shelter in one corner, and enough open ground between the structures for a group of 7 to move without negotiating for space. The 7 had arranged themselves, over the months they had been together, into the particular social geometry that forms wherever a group of macaques has enough time and room to sort itself out. The higher-ranking animals moving freely between the upper platforms and the ground. The middle animals occupying the spaces in between. The youngest moving among all of them with the easy fluency of individuals who have never known the enclosure any other way. They had a language between them, of proximity and posture, of who yielded and who did not, of which spaces were open and which were not. And it was not a language that could be learned quickly or from the outside. He did not know this language. On the morning they released him into the enclosure, he walked a few steps from the gate and stopped in the open ground and did not move toward any of the structures or any of the 7. His head turned when a staff member crossed the far path outside the wall. It turned again when someone moved near the gate. The 7 continued their morning around him with the self-contained attention of animals whose day is already organized and who have not yet found a reason to reorganize it. He watched them the way he had learned to watch things, from a position that kept the largest possible amount of the space in view, and he did not follow. The days that followed held no single dramatic event, no clear threshold, no visible confrontation that a camera could isolate and name. There was only the persistent small fact of his separateness, present every morning when the group woke, every afternoon when it moved, every evening when it settled. A fact that no one acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required noticing him in particular, and the 7 had not yet found a reason to do that. He ate at the edge of the feeding area when the others had finished, taking what remained without moving toward the center where the group clustered. On the climbing structures, he used the lower platforms, the ones the others passed through on their way to somewhere higher, and he did not follow them up even when the upper spaces stood empty and the path was clear. He slept at the outer margin of the group's sheltered corner, present within the loose perimeter of their warmth, occupying a position that was near enough to count as within and far enough to never require acknowledgement from either side. In the mornings, when the group moved from the shelter to the open ground, he followed at a distance that was consistent enough to seem intentional, close enough to be oriented toward them, far enough to be oriented toward nothing in particular. And the staff who observed him noted his physical health and recorded his social distance and continued with their rounds. A macaque, outside its social group, is not simply an animal that happens to be alone. The group is the structure within which a macaque's nervous system learned to function, and without it, the animal continues its routines, the way a clock continues to run in an empty room, keeping accurate time for no one, the mechanism intact, and the purpose quietly absent. I was healthy in every way that could be observed and measured, but his head still turned, a fraction of a second before anything else, toward the sound of human footsteps at the perimeter of the enclosure, and the distance between him and the 7 remained what it had been on the first morning, held in place by nothing that could be pointed to or addressed. Then, one afternoon, the light already long and low, the shadows of the climbing frames stretching eastward across the ground, the group beginning its slow drift toward the sheltered corner. One of the younger animals paused at the edge of the open ground and sat down. She was not the smallest of the 7 and not the most marginal. She moved through the enclosure with the ease of an animal that belongs to a group without being defined by its belonging, present in a way that drew no particular attention. In the days before, she could sometimes be seen pausing at the edge of the open ground and looking in his direction without approaching, standing for a moment with her weight settled, neither moving toward him nor turning away, before rejoining the others as though she had simply stopped to rest. She sat down now at a distance from him that was close enough to be deliberate and far enough to require nothing of either of them. She looked at the middle distance with the settled quality of an animal that has made a small decision and is simply inhabiting it. I looked at her. She did not look back. The light moved another degree across the ground, and the afternoon went on around them, and neither changed position. And after a while she stood and rejoined the others, and the enclosure went quiet in the gradual way of enclosures at the end of a day. The following afternoon, she came back to the same spot, and the afternoon after that. She did not approach him directly, and she did not make any gesture toward contact, and nothing between them changed in any way that could be recorded. And yet something in the enclosure was different from the days before she had started coming. Different in the way that a room is different when a window has been opened somewhere else in the building. A shift in pressure so slight you could not say when it had begun. He had stopped turning his head toward the gate on a morning that arrived like any other. The staff moving through the enclosure with the feeding equipment. The group stirring in the shelter. The light still flat and early across the eastern wall. She walked directly to where he was sitting and groomed the back of his neck for a few seconds, her fingers moving through his fur with the quick, certain attention of an animal for whom this gesture is as ordinary as breathing. And then she stopped and walked away without looking back. He sat very still while it happened. He did not pull back. He did not follow her. But the angle of his body, when she had gone, was turned by some small and unplanned degree toward the part of the enclosure where she had gone. The way a plant turns toward light it cannot see directly, by means it could not explain. That afternoon, the group moved, as it did at that hour every day, toward the sheltered corner where the shadow arrived first and the temperature dropped earliest, and the last of the day could be spent in the particular comfort of familiar ground. She went with them, as she always did, and halfway across the open ground, she stopped and looked back. I was where he had spent so many afternoons, in the open space between the structures, in the part of the enclosure that had become his part by the simple accumulation of days spent in it. She waited with the patience of an animal that does not experience waiting as a cost. He looked at her. He looked past her at the group settling into the shadow of the shelter. He looked at her again. Then he stood up. He crossed the open ground at the unhurried pace of an animal that has made a decision and is simply carrying it out. No urgency, no hesitation, as though the decision had been made some time ago and this was only the moment of its expression. He reached the edge of the sheltered corner and sat down at its margin in the last strip of afternoon light before the shadow began. And the group around him shifted almost imperceptibly. Not a welcome, not an acknowledgement. Simply the small unconscious adjustment that bodies make when another body has entered the space they share and intends to stay. She had already turned back to the others. Hans sat at the edge of the shadow, and the afternoon moved on around him, the light continuing its long withdrawal from the ground, the group breathing and resting in the ordinary way of animals that have nowhere else to be. The shadow moved forward by degrees, the way shadows always move, without announcement, without any single moment that could be identified as the moment of change, and covered the last strip of light where he was sitting, and he was in the shade with the others, and the boundary between his place and theirs dissolved into nothing, the way boundaries do when what separated them was only light, and the light is gone. The enclosure was quiet. The group rested together. An hour's drive away, the mountain held its quiet the way it always had, and the station on its slope sat in the last of the afternoon, with the pines moving in a low wind off the ridge, the light falling through the window of the small back room at the same angle it had always fallen, crossing the same section of floor where a square of fleece had once been pressed flat each morning and smoothed at the edges before the day began, landing now on bare boards, on nothing in particular. The way light lands on everything it reaches, without preference, briefly, before the day ends, and it is gone.